Good evening and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo. Um, it's been a while since I've done one of these and don't expect them a lot. I'm actually testing out new equipment because in the chaos of the last month, and for those of you who follow the Patreon or even follow my X account, you may know that my house was flooded about 2.5 weeks ago. It's weird. I live in the desert. There's not been a lot of rain. The flood was a mechanical error from hard water, busted the water main. Um, uh, Unrelatedly, seemingly, a lot of my equipment died at the same time. Luckily, I have patrons and they empowered me to buy new equipment. Thank you. It's gotten here, and here we are. You might notice some difference in color saturation and sound quality and movement. But I figured I might as well do a real show today. I haven't done one in a while. You guys may have noticed that most of the stuff that I've been showing you is since January. And as you can see, things are chaotic here. I have stacks of books everywhere. So let's get into what I want to talk about today. And why I want to talk about it. We're back into the semantic debates about what is what is not fascism. And let's ask ourselves for a second what that matters. Why does that matter to so many people? Why does it come up at all? Why are we always talking about this historical use of a term? It's an interesting question, and one that kind of frankly seems to be an almost self deluding distraction. Like, what is so important and invested about the semantics of a historical category? Now, as a person who does lots of videos on the semantics of historical categories, I obviously have some weight in this, but I've really thought about what people invest in this idea that they are fighting fascism, why this may not actually help them do any damn thing, and what it means when you talk about the resistance. Because that's not something you can just meaningfully LARP. We came up again with the whole debating versus punching Nazis debate, and I wanted to just flat out say that's optics, including the punching Nazis part. You know that everyone felt good about almost a decade ago now when that Richard Spencer just got punched in the mouth. I guess it was a half decade ago now, right? You clapped. Did that change a goddamn thing? Did it change anything? Like, we can talk about argumentum ad Hitlerum forever, right? Which isn't even necessarily the best model of fascism to base yourself on. It's Nazism, and particularly the Hitler branch that became dominant in it, has some weird traits even compared to the Falange, our Brazilian integralism, our right-wing Peronism, our classical Italian fascism, are the pre-fascist Bonapartist movements. So what are we learning here? What are we doing here? What are we thinking about, right? Like you think about all this investment in a term. One, there's a lesson about the resistance, and the lesson isn't what you think it is, and it's not what people are going to expect of me. A lot of people think that I take this Borgist stance from the Italian left communists that you should fight fascists like you fight any um, capitalist, and that you should have been pretty neutral there. I don't actually believe that. I have argued over and over again that fascism, if it has any set of coherent traits, is a subset of Bonapartism that is more focused on an integrated state and has both an attempt to integrate elements of the left and right together for what might be considered right-wing means. But remember, left and right are not platonic states that have stable definitions. I know a lot of people want them to, but that's neither how the language work nor how historical movements work. There's no form of liberation that exists in the universe that the left is moving towards, and there's no form of order that the right is moving towards. And if you don't realize that, you're going to be often confused by the fact that coherence, ideological coherence, is not particularly relevant to what people are doing, and calling them a hypocrite all the time is pretty useless. But why LARP about resistance? Because the resistance historically doesn't mean what people think it means. The Popular Front, which was started in 1936 in France, which was a revaloration of pre-Marxist left movements in France that way predate 1936. In fact, there are references to popular fronts going all the way back to the second um, French Revolution. So resistance, whether we like it or not, can't be equated cleanly and simply to just the Popular Front. But even the Popular Front did not win by internal actions in any place it was tried. Two things accelerated the ending of World War II: the invasion of Stalingrad and Stalin's response, and the US finally entering the war after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Neither one of those events has a goddamn thing to do with what most of the actions of the resistance in France or the war effort in Britain were doing by themselves. One of the ironies about talking about using World War II style resistance, and this is something that Danny Besner actually points out people should actually be more depressed by, is that it is not a story of the internal victory of left wing or liberal forces joining together and defeating internally a menace. It is a story of people finally being able to join up with larger forces to do something. And when those forces are not on the horizon, LARPing that you're doing the same thing as a coalition of Gaullist and Marxist and the edges of France is not even a good historical metaphor. It makes you feel good, but it isn't particularly great. So we talk about debating or punching Nazis or debating and punching MAGA. We should call people by what they call themselves. I mean, you can call them fascists, fascistoids, whatever. I can get very technical that I think they're a Bonapartist, para-fascist, or post-fascist movement that has European conservative and populist elements in it, but also Cadillo politics from Latin America, and also our own native-born corporatism, and both the old sense and the new. But none of that, not a goddamn bit of it's going to tell you what they're actually going to do, because they have different historical conditions, more degraded ones, frankly, than even what we were dealing with Europe at the end of the interwar period. And we have different historical conditions. And just trying to pretend that you were stuck in the part of the 20th century that your parents idolized their grandparents for, because it's one time where everybody kind of looks like they're on the moral end of a major world war and there actually is a clear villain, which most of the history of war does not have. And frankly, the Allies look good kind of by accident. I don't know what you get from that. Sometimes I say something super inflammatory, like imagine if MAGA comes from such degraded conditions that in the long run it's even worse than what you call fascism. Like, just because I say it might not be fascism doesn't even mean I'm downplaying it. So what's the addiction for? One of the things I found funny was people are going up and looking the OSSS, the not OSSS, the OSS handbook for sabotaging movements. Now it was first used on fascists, but it was also used on communists. And one of the things it talks about is bog people down in semantics and needless debate. But the problem that we have is we don't have shared definitions. So we never get to the point where we could have a solid assertion of what we mean so that we don't get bogged down in debate. But how much ink, how much discourse hours, how much this and that is wasted on whether or not the United States or whatever country, Russia, Ukraine, whatever, is fascist, is Nazis, instead of it's its own thing that has its own conditions that may or may not rhyme with this use of a word that you're pretending has some kind of platonic form meaning that's eternal for a very frankly short-lived political ideology. Bonapartism, Caesarism, unitary executive thought is old. It's older than capitalism. But fascism was a particular crisis. And you can say something like, oh, fascism is capitalism in crisis. Sure, great. It's one of the many things that happen. You know what is also capitalism in crisis? Keynesianism is capitalism in crisis. Fordism was capitalism in crisis. They're all ways to manage the problems and perverse incentives in the economy. All right. That's really what we're dealing with. Whether your optics are about symbolic violence or symbolic debating, it's somewhat irrelevant. And frankly, whether or not you call your enemy a fascist or a post-fascist or whatever, a Trumpist or uh, a right populist, none of those concepts have agreed upon and set meanings. So that's a distraction for what you actually need to do to respond. When you are so caught up in historical analogies that you literally can't predict what's going to happen next, even when people are telling you it's a problem. And I have made that mistake on a more recent scale. I assume Trump 2 would be a slightly more unpleasant version of Trump 1. I was wrong. I'm pretty clear that I was wrong. While all of Project 2025 isn't happening, the parts about replacing the executive state is happening. And what we're learning is you don't even need to be particularly competent to do it. It seems like there isn't any competent group of people in society to run anything or to have principles of solidarity with each other. And this even goes down to labor. The UAW, you know, Sean Fain's group, the good union as opposed to the Teamsters, which was the bad union, is showing no solidarity to the integration of North American capital and thinks it can buy time by tariffing every foreign car as if that's going to do anything to its own inability to compete. That's my point, Mick. Being stuck on the aesthetics and the semantics of the situation in real time is often a distraction from dealing with it, even if it allows you to posture more radically than you are. And look, this is not just the left posturing. We have people now, MAGA people pretending that they're hardened warriors from the trenches of the Sorbonne at the end of the Kaiserreich coming back home who have the esprit de corps of people who just lost a war, when we haven't seen people in mass deployed combat in the United States in that kind of capacity since Iraq, which is half a generation ago at this point. The military has been doing most of its fighting with long distance weapons and drones, which does take a major psychological toll on people, but doesn't have the effect of the esprit de corps of units being bombed in trenches. Now, does it? But people talk all the time on the right as if that's the condition from which they come from. You got people who served one tour in the military talking as if they can go out and fight hardened gang members and cartels in Mexico and just roll through it by their sheer force of will and their AR-15, which is ridiculous. Because one side is frankly way more battle hardened than the other. I keep on repeating this phrase from Adorno all the time, and I don't think people really get what I'm saying. A wrong life cannot be lived rightly. I am not saying that the focus on the left is what we should do. In fact, the ruthless critique of everything is not just a ruthless critique of the people who you think should agree with you because they share your nominal ideology or nominal political aesthetics. The movements of basic military ops to special forces is super important, which is why we're having trouble with the Houthis, because we really haven't done a lot of that. And the Houthis are, how do you say, actually battle hardened. They've been fighting the Saudis and the other Yemenis for, I don't know, 2 decades now. And this is where there's so much delusion right now in American life. You have a group of, and we need to be specific, this is gendered, but not in the way most people think. You have a group of young, we're gonna have to deal with this autofocus, auto follow stuff. It's even making me dizzy. Um, let me see if I can turn it off while I talk. We have a group of young men who have no friends, no real prospect, spend an inordinate amount of the internet. If they're blue collar, 1/8 of them are basically unemployed. More than 40% of them are underemployed. Um, they are undereducated, even by high school standards, and are exposed to wild ideologies for which they can project upon the world all the time, both left and right. And it's aiming at younger and younger groups. Anecdotally and evidentially, when I was talking about the effects of Jordan Peterson, I was talking about 20-year-old men. When I'm talking about the effects of Andrew Tate, I'm talking about 14 to 16-year-olds. When you think about that, it means that there's a whole lot it's going to be very difficult for people to deal with. Because the kind of isolation and alienation these ideologies prey upon are, in general, endemic in society. And I'm not just talking about like incelism or anything like that. But the audience and the targeting for them go down to people who are dealing with the normal human alienation of shifting from a child to an adult, which in almost every society it's painful and has rites and rituals to allow that to happen, many of which we've cut out are postponed later and later and later in life. So what do you think is going to happen? You can tell people to turn off the internet, but then how are they going to get a fucking job? Who takes paper applications anymore? Unfortunately, you have to deal with the world that you actually live in instead of the world that you want to live in. I also am beginning to hate what the internet does to people, the parasocial attachments and whatever. But, ironically, I make a supplement to my income and am able to do this educational project by that very means that I'm complaining about. And since most of the kids that we see are in a complete disarray of how to handle it because they're right. All right. There's some things we have to deal with. For example, the moral posturing related to identities and marginalization that you see in academia that most of us respond to when we complain about PMC culture or whatever and pretend to somehow current social class. But most of that alienation is real because it is a group of people that are supposedly there for meritocratic competence that were granted that meritocratic competence outside of the market, mostly during conditions of the Cold War. Then leftists, for whatever reason, entered that space because it was protected from market conditions, used it, but what most of that stuff has ended up being used for is to protect the feelings of an elite in society that's primary function is to serve government or military development and capital by pretending that they're somehow deeply anti-capitalist because they're exempted from the worst elements of the market, kind of, that then spread that around as if taking upper middle class students from sub-Saharan Africa or extremely rich students from sub-Saharan Africa to meet racial quotas that you made up is actually helping the local black community and being surprised when things like ADOS happen. I've been talking about the implications, Mick, of complexity for a long time. And we're going to bring complexity back into this because the semantics and all the LARPing and massive online role playing and all this that we see today is partly because a lot of people really haven't ever been tested and definitely want it, but don't know how to get it. There's no place in their life for it, even in the terms of like capital. And leftists are constantly invented new semantic categories to like not deal with the fact capital has changed in ways that they haven't predicted because they've been bad at predicting things. Most of you live off of projections of your own fears, which which could be true. I mean, they're not. When I say that, I'm not saying they're not possible. I mean, one of the things we have to deal with is from the standpoint of our assumptions as Marxists, the material interest that we see in capital, we often come up with damn near conspiracy theories to explain what are otherwise irrational actions by leaders. You can see this in all this bullshit about the Mar-a-Lago Accords, which, if is true, still doesn't make any sense. Devaluing the dollar to increase your trade export when your trade export was already based on the power of the dollar, and doing so by leveling tariffs on the only people your tariffs can affect, which are people who are privately integrated into your economy, which would breed distrust from them ever trading and buying your products in the future, is a very stupid plan to reindustrialize. Doesn't deal with the fact that reindustrialization wouldn't bring that many jobs back because, frankly, it's been automated to the point that it doesn't matter. That's before you deal with AI. You have irrational AI economics going all over the place for something that does not yet seem to be profitable, can only be profitable by driving down the market for it to the point that people can't pay for it. It's incredibly energy intensive on the back end, which is not paid for by the user. And then on top of all of that is eating up resources in places that don't have them. I live in a place that's talking about opening up a nuclear power plant in a place without sufficient water for drinking now, and 4 server farms in a desert with no plans of how to get the water. This, even by capitalist standards, is not a rational society because it isn't even that profitable. The only way you're going to have to deal with a lot of this is just the realization that some of the complexity isn't fixable. I said today, uh, that I've thought a lot about this. I've assumed that the military was much more prepared and competent for what was going to happen than it is, and it's not. Like, no one's ever accused me of assuming that CIA. I mean, I've critiqued a lot of leftists for assuming that the American intelligence agencies are nearly, omnipotent in power, and there's a lot of people who oppose them who have actually a good reason to pretend that they are, because it's a good way to gin up their own base of support and fear. But let's just set that aside for a moment. It's clear that they had no plan. For all the talk of ending democracy and all this, they had no plan. And a lot of people are like, oh, they're complicit. Yes, they're complicit. But let's quit trying to read the minds of why people do things, because at some level, it doesn't matter why people did what they did. You're never going to know the souls of every actor. And assuming that aggregate effect and aggregate motivation goes back down to individual actors is a whole to part composition fallacy. It literally is an always wrong assumption. You can't deduce from either an aggregate or a collective, which I don't really see as the same thing anyway. I'm literally now writing a chapter of a book trying to explain this. Collectives are either imaginary or institutional. Aggregates are just what individual actors or individual units do in aggregate. I move enough in different areas of society that all kinds of people believe in all kinds of things. But the thing we have to remember is it's easy for us to project that only Trumpists are delusional about the competency of their leaders when we just saw and people go, well, Trumpists believe, they believe that whatever they think is good is what Trump is going to do, despite what he says. And that's true. But my my brothers in truth and sisters in truth and whoever else in truth, what the fuck did we do to Barack Obama and Joe Biden? How much projection upon what we wanted them to do versus what they actually said did we do? Ours is obviously a little bit more sophisticated, but not that much more sophisticated. The fact that we use bigger words to do it and are less given to obvious contradictions and instead hide in more subtle contradictions doesn't change that this is a total society problem. Focusing on either the left or the right when you look at this is missing the fact that this is endemic to this society, period. We project upon leaders because we feel powerless. We project upon institutions because we feel powerless. Now, whether or not we personalize it in the leader or personalize it in the institution does seem to be a sort of conservative liberal difference, but the fundamental psychological and social function that is doing that is kind of the same. And that is hard, hard, hard for people to accept. Because it implies that even if you're smart, even if you do the right things, even if you believe a good ideology, that you're not escaping those contradictions of society. Just because you know the truth doesn't get you out of it, even. When you guys talk about this in Trump and like the undermining of mass power, you lived through that with the Democrats, right? BLM was so recuperated almost instantly the second time it came around that we forgot the context of the first time and we forgot what happened in the first week because what we got out of it was DEI programs and more diversity on television, and what we're getting out of it now is backlash. So we're all embarrassed and pretending we all saw through it, just like we did with Occupy and any other frankly spontaneous action LARP that we've been doing for the last 100 fucking years. But why are we erasing that? Because it implies a complicity that we don't want to deal with. And the fact that there's a faddishness and an irrationality that, frankly, most left wing or liberal ideology, and those are not the same thing in my mind, I want to be very clear on that, assume shouldn't happen. We assume at some level, whether we admit it or not, that what is real is rational. What if it isn't? Because you have a lot of reason right now to believe that it isn't. I keep on seeing people on the left, both on the left that's pro Trump, which is weird in a very small minority, but they exist, and on the left of the people who dastardly oppose Trump, coming up with elaborate ideologies and plans that are near a conspiracy level to make sense of what is happening, because the idea that this is stochastic people failing upwards at every level of society in some ways is too horrifying to deal with. That there really is no one competent at enough things to actually pull any massive change off in society. The kidnapping people and deporting them to foreign gulags feels different than anything I have seen in my life. Maybe I'm wrong, I'm biased. Do you remember the War on Terror? Because we sure as fuck did it. We had a whole black site set up, even in places that we now consider enemies, to do it. The only difference was that you had to be, you could be a U.S., there we go again. You could be a U.S. citizen. You could be a U.S. citizen and they do it to you. It just wouldn't happen on U.S. soil. The difference now is they're targeting non-citizens on U.S. soil without crimes, or with very minor crimes. But everything they're doing, everything doesn't come from Project 2025 on this. It's implied in the Patriot Act, which has bipartisan support for over a generation now. You have to be my age to really remember when we couldn't just do that. It does feel different because they're doing it for people for much lower reasons. But no, it is not new. Mass deportations for no reason, even of green card holders and possible citizens, is not new. Look at the 1950s in the Eisenhower program. The acceleration of everything is new. Remember, there's a Hegelian principle that's actually useful to you here. Eventually, a difference in quantity becomes a difference in quality. And we've seen this stepped up for a long time. Fabian Martinez is right. We saw this kind of attempted in Portland with DHS running up people, which was an acceleration of what the Bush administration did to environmental activists in the aughts. Do you remember the Green Scare? All of this is justified by a legal regime that was built off of either RICO to fight the mob or the Patriot Act, all of which has been weaponized for political reasons going back to the Cold War. But you're right that it is different because it isn't new, but the scale and the people who are they targeting are. But when people are like, I'm seeing people go, oh, what a rational time we lived in when Mitt Romney and Obama were shaking hands. I saw this on Twitter today. No, they were already in our world. The world that we live in was well on its way by that time. All you had at that point is optics. The harsh reality of the situation is that as soon as, and I'm talking about America here specifically, as soon as we started democratizing more and more elements of U.S. society, and after World War I, we also started putting poison pills and all those democratizing elements, and they're all coming home to roost. Well, I mean, Bushman was also bad. I mean, I am kind of staggered at the incompetence of our leadership at all levels, and I'm not just talking about in the government. I'm also talking about the bean counters at private universities. I'm talking about the military industrial establishment, including the private sector of it. I'm talking about the entire foreign policy apparatus, including large parts of it not in the United States. Many of you think for good reason that politics is about moral categories, and I see it in the way you talk. Like you talk about lost humanity. What does that mean? Humanity is such a variated thing. I study, one of the things I studied before I got into literature with anthropology. And there's this big debate about whether or not humans are selfless or vicious. And we have always been both. We've always produced sick societies as well as healthy ones. We've always produced egalitarian and non-egalitarian societies. Fuck, a third of us are descended from cannibals. We literally ate our social inferiors. And not just, I'm not just talking about this in the racist way that people in the 19th century would talk about non-white people. No, I am not. There's not a single race of people that doesn't have some elements of some level of cannibalism. We also, however, compared to, you can't bring this down too much. This show is not about giving you hope. If you need hope to do what you need to do to help society, then you don't deserve hope. Not that anything's about what anyone deserves anyway. Am I the left wing guy? What does that mean? I mean, it's really interesting to me what people think left and right is when I'm always telling you that those things are relative categories. That the reason why they've stuck around compared to other metaphors to describe politics is because they're relative categories. You're going to catch all kinds of things to them. I'm not here to talk. I mean, like, look, I do think it's a virtue to have hope, but you know where hope should come from? That you are willing to do the work even when it doesn't seem like there's any hope there. Because if you need hope from the outside, what are you going to do? You're always dependent on someone else for that. Right? Now, look, you will always be dependent on your social group at some level. Like no man ever makes everything by themselves and doesn't go crazy. This is why if I was to throw you in a room by yourself or even in an island by yourself and left you completely alone, you probably aren't going to last long. I'll tell you some things that might put stuff in perspective for you. Maybe it won't. I don't know. I'm just a guy. But I always think about, I've had this question privately to some of my more liberal friends. It's hilarious to me that I'm always getting harassed. I voted for Democrats at a national level in the executive once in 44 years. My God, this is real funny to me. Um, in fact, a lot of the people who say I do this shill for the Democrats are people who voted for Democrats more than I have. It's whatever. I mean, in some ways, there is no way out but through. And I've been somewhat shocked that some of the stuff I've been saying does seem to be true. Like sometimes when you're right, it's just as shocking as when you're wrong. I've told you where I'm wrong, but this whole complexity stuff, things are actually playing out the way I think it would be when I look at it from a complexity perspective and not from my perceived ideological perch. There are too many specialists who know very little about one thing, but because they know a whole lot about a very tiny bit of humanity, think they can vouch for everything. This leads to hubris and more mistakes, not from the stupid people, but from the smart ones. And that isn't just because liberals overestimate their intelligence and overestimate the value of raw critical intelligence. You know, knowledge is power. Well, knowledge is helpful to power, but let me tell you what power is. Power is power, and it comes from three things: social control, social solidarity, or force. Social solidarity is the one that we should hope that we like, but it's real hard to build. Social control is fragile, and force, if you overuse it, will weaken you. But those are the origins of political and social power: charisma, love, and violence in common phraseology. Some of you are so used to religious people using abstracts that you don't understand what teleology is. And then you think you're doing materialism when you don't know what material is either. The way see people throw around material interest, blah, 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 when they have no idea what the fuck they're materially talking about is kind of amazing. But when we talk about complexity, we're talking about the amount of energy it literally takes to reproduce society. As you get better at tools, it takes more and more energy in physical man hours or in petro or whatever to maintain a more and more specific subfunction. And you become more and more dependent on those tools to the point you can't recreate the tools. And we are definitely seeing that with AI. Do you think in a generation of people using AI to code, if something goes wrong in the AI code, they're going to know how to do it? They're going to think the machine can do it for them. Forgetting that machine literally right now is just replicating all your own thoughts back at you. Okay, so let's talk about, it's okay to ask what word means. And if I use a word over your head, or if you want, like, I'm not going to get mad about people asking me to clarify because I speak in a very particular way. Um, and I'm a generalist in a time period where there's not a whole lot of generalists left. All right. Like I've said before, we have left general knowledge acquisition mostly the journalist. And who do we want to be journalists? Well, people who can take unpaid internships for several years, but also have massive connections, which means they're increasingly disconnected from the base of society because who can do that? But the fail sons of elites who want to do something nice with their life. That's not sustainable, by the way. That's not a sustainable model for how you get information out and who the generalists are, but that is ours. The other generalists I thought were in the military, but apparently I am apparently wrong about that at this point. So here we are. But to bring this back, what I mean by complexity is the following: you need more and more expertise, and that expertise requires more and more training that requires physical manpower and energy to do. It also has a risk to form a self-perpetuating machine to overtrain for any given thing, which is why we overtrain PhDs and whatnot. They actually keep the people who do the technical training in work, even though doing so undermines their own position. The cost of that bureaucracy is incredibly high, so they're trying to cut out the middleman and discipline the labor in things like coding, which is why software engineers, scrum masters, and that kind of thing, which are basically uber labor aristocrats in the general form. I don't mean that in the classical Marxist sense of that term, but in that they have more privileges and less work discipline than everybody else, are now getting disciplined hard. But the issue is, if you if you have something so complex and a tool so complex that you never train lower engineers and lower bureaucracy to do it, you're going to have a massive brain drain fairly quickly, like half a generation. And no, there's no way something that basically is a predictor of intellectual labor by modules and statistical prediction and aggregate is going to actually be able to sufficiently replace higher level labor, but it will lead to de-skilling. And we see this in general literacy. This is not just the fault of a bad education system, although that plays a large part of it, but it's the fault of the entire society de-skilling itself, because you even see people who came from generations that were better educated losing their educational capacity fairly quickly. And even like the abundance, the abundance resistance neoliberal crowd like Ezra Klein really do need all this shit to be way more functional than it is. Whereas people like Ed Citron and myself sometimes underplay its functionality because we don't like its functionality, but it is functional for certain things. What do you mean by educational capacity? Um, well, there's both institutional capacity and frankly intellectual capacity. Do you live in a society that incentivizes intellectual pursuits in a way that allows you to accumulate skills necessary to reproduce yourself? Or are you in a decadent society that can no longer afford because of the level of complexity and energy going into it? I mean, in AI, it is literally an energy suck. That is making it where you no longer can train the people to maintain the systems that are doing the energy sucking. So there's both institutional educational capacity, which we've already seen be sucked out of universities. Remember what I've told you what universities really are. I'm even hearing liberals now admit this. You know, oh, I miss my university days, but I kind of have to admit that basically most universities are hedge funds with a humanities program to assuage their conscience. And we see this across the board. I started noticing, Boscore is mentioning this. I started noticing this about 5 years ago. Now, I'm not a believer in neo-feudalism because I think it misunderstands what feudalism is, and that capitalism has always subsisted off of rents, not just commodity profits. And that really fucks with a lot of people who have this notion of pure commodity capitalism as if that ever existed. It existed in the pages of Adam Smith as an abstract model, and Marx uses that in Das Kapital, but even he says that that's not the case. Get past Capital Volume 1, god damn it, and you'll see it. But the university as we know it, its expansion. Universities educated about 5% of the population. They were true professionals. By that, I mean people that we would consider in Marxist terms petit bourgeois, in that they literally sold their labor and had no employer. In law and clergy, and then medicine. That's what universities were for. That was their purpose, going all the way back to their establishment in the European Middle Ages. They educated about 5% of the population. They only jumped to about 20% after the GI Bill. And while that's an America only phenomenon, it actually reflected phenomenon in the entire world. Universities have always been commodified, but they were hyper commodified after their use for Cold War propaganda ended. Most of the functions that all the leftists who entered, I mean, this is a primary contradiction of society, but ironically, the leftists who did the Great March to the Academy after the New Left and emerging from the New Left because they thought the students were a model and these students were the students of the working class. At least that was true at the time. That really was true at the time. Because of the expansion of this and trying to train them for management led to credentialing Red Queen game, that's where you have to run faster and faster to stay in the same place, where things that didn't require credentials, our management skills started to ask for them. Then this got commodified as the Cold War largesse ended because we weren't fighting the communists anymore. There were still communists, but they were cooperative with us, at least from our perspective. Whether or not they had another long game is a different story. But that is what the Americans told themselves when Duggan came to power after '82, and particularly after the end of, because the neoliberalization of the university started before the fall of the Soviet Union, but after the Soviet Union was no longer actually perceived as a real threat, which is probably in the early 70s. What you had was a massive expansion of bureaucracy. And one of the things that is ironic about neoliberalism is that it privatizes so much, but it's dependent on public money to do that privatization. And it actually expands bureaucracy, but removes it from government oversight. There's more, like, one of the things I was shocked about is how much bureaucracy exists in firms and venture capital organizations, as much or more than at like state level governments, because state level governments actually have fiscal constraints that the federal government or corporations do not. But one thing you have to remember is neoliberalism didn't descend from nowhere and fuck everything up. It actually is, and I need to say this over and over again, an extension of Fordist and Keynesian logic. This is not pre-recorded. I'm live. I'm live from my house without a kitchen, then and a new weird camera because my camera broke after the flood, etc., etc., etc. One of the other ironies of neoliberalism is it actually requires more and more documentation of compliance, which requires both more specialization and more bullshit jobs, as David Graeber would say, except the jobs aren't bullshit. They're necessary to record what is going on, so both stakeholders and the government can have some way of monitoring what the hell is going on. But that requires more and more manpower for more and more tedious and frankly non-productive tasks. It also requires more and more capital investment in ways that really aren't productive to anything. But nothing is productive to anything. It's not just the public sector anymore. Like, look at private equity firms. They exist to vampirize each other. Look at short-termism and stocks. This is now a system where the very profit motive means that they destroy the commodity base of the profit motive and jump from one to the other. But you have to ask yourself, when I talk about the change from a qualitative difference from a quantitative difference, so it's a change in kind and amount and who's at the table, that really does eventually become a different thing. There's no one eventual shift that makes that happen. There's no great apocalypse that makes it happen. Most things happen by accumulation, static change, not even evolution, because we attach idiotically, by the way, some kind of teleological notion that evolution is everything's getting better and more fit. No, the fuck it's not. Conditions are just changing. And when they change again, it'll be maladaptive. I appreciate it about Habitat Humanity. I used to volunteer for them back in the day. No, I don't own this house. I rent it. I did own a house when I first moved back to America. Thank you, foreign capital. But I lost it in a divorce. Actually, I kind of gave it up in a divorce because I felt like I was put in an immoral choice where I had to force my ex-wife, to sell a home that we bought together after she got over fighting cancer, or take a loss. And I chose the loss. I don't want to make it sound like I'm some hero or something. I had no idea that our home was going to become super valuable 2 months later, come to COVID, property speculations. But nonetheless, that's the end of personal stuff. But I've been thinking, I was going to bring it back because I've been asked, well, what should we do if some ex-MAGA people want to join the resistance? We're not going to take them. They were bigots or whatever. And I keep thinking about this. This is a stance of people who've never had to really struggle to survive in an acute way. They might be struggling to survive in like a rat race way, like everybody is, in America. I'm not saying they don't have hard times. In fact, I know this person, two people I'm thinking about actually do. But I'll give an example. When I was in Monte Degla, shit hit the fan when sugar collapsed after the Egyptian pound, the Egyptian guinea completely lost its value when they floated it on the market at the insistence of both the IMF and the Chinese. And I actually want to point that out because that's something a lot of people miss. And it led to currency devaluation in a massive scale. This is one of the reasons why I often argue with MMTers, because one of the things MMTers often suggest countries do, Egypt did, it was a disaster. Now, they didn't build up the productive capacity or have the international leverage for it to work, but nonetheless, it's neither here nor there. But there were riots, and then there was a military crackdown on pretty much anybody who was just out in the streets. And I was just buying groceries. Yay. And a salafist shop owner hid me in the basement of his store. Now, we don't share much ideologically. I'm not a Muslim. He's not a leftist or a liberal. He's not Western sympathetic. But am I going to turn down aid, friendship, and solidarity over an ideological issue in a life or death situation? No. So when people tell me, oh, can we reject the ex-MAGA? I'm like, fine. I mean, you can do what you want. But if you're really in the situation that you say you're in, that is horribly stupid. So either you don't believe things are as bad as you say they are, you don't know what that means, or you're not really in an acute situation. So what's the point in like trying to hold tail on purity when people want to come over to you for material reasons? People who aren't bigots often become bigots because they hang out with bigots because the bigots protect them in some way. And by the way, the reverse is also true. So being that kind of preemptively selective on a moral purity test issue is unbelievably counterproductive. And yet a certain group of people who come from predominantly, although not all, from certain subcategories and subclasses of people, usually relatively white collar elite people who are used to having their morality say something about why they're allowed to do something because they can't justify it incompetence anymore. Because their competence, not because they don't have competence, but because their competence is too narrow. Yes, it is hard to make and grow social ties. I lived outside of the United States and coming back here as a 40, I mean, I was in my late 30s at the time, but now I'm in my mid 40s. And I find this to be an alienating place. And I have skills to de-alienate myself because I lived in these other places. I know how the community actually works. It being this bad is the result of policy decisions going all the way back probably to the 19th century, but definitely since World War II. And most people can't deal with social clubs. And why would they? Because a lot of social clubs that we deal with on the left are parasitic. They're about empowering the people who start them. They do actually follow that Robert Michel rule where there's the people who set it up. They're maybe even perfectly democratic when they do set it up. And then they don't want to give up their identity as the people who founded this org, as the people who set up this org. It's really hard to give that identity up. And you don't even totally blame them if you think about what you would do in the same position, probably doing the same thing, but it has pernicious effects because it actually means that people who enter later can't really do anything. And if you think this is bad in socialist orgs, wait till you hear about business unions. But what happens now is there's so few of these actual institutions left whether it's like Shriners or Masons or fucking normal churches. I mean, I was complaining today about how many American Christians are totally biblically illiterate and unchurched. Biblical illiteracy, frankly, is not new. Most Christians, even in times where the Bible was the only thing they read, there were so many ideological blinders on that stuff that you really couldn't deal with it anyway. But there you go. This is a reason why I will support left organizations, but I don't tend to join them. Why? Because I don't want to subject myself to that either. You know, I'm hoping most of these organizations will get subsumed into something larger, but maybe that never happens. And one of the ugly things about Marxist theory is all the stuff we say is supposed to happen based off of immiseration, our development, our whatever you want to talk about. There's thousands of theories. But when we actually look at it, most of them happen in the case of global geopolitical conflict that was not actually in the control of the people forming the revolution in the first place, and they got lucky. To set up a group that doesn't do that requires an amazing amount of discipline, and I'm not sure that any group necessarily avoids it forever. And I think a lot of what I'm saying is actually hitting in all kinds of directions. You know, can you do a DOA case in point with the Working Family Party? I don't know about Kasama Sarant's org enough. But yeah. I mean, yeah, Boskar says luck is preparation plus opportunity, but some of it is stochastic events that you don't have any control over. I mean, that one of the things about the objective conditions things is objective conditions actually are really, really hard to predict, even when you're really good at analysis. One of the problems is that individuals actually do matter when they're at choke points of the situation, and individuals are highly volatile variables. Just like in physics, like it's hard to predict what a fucking quark is going to do, but I know what's going to happen when I drop a pound of bricks. And I think that paradox is hard for like leftists to understand, that there are rules for aggregates of people that are fairly predictable and can predict interest and sectional actions and whatever. But when there are choke points with individuals at the choke point, it is hard to predict what's going to happen. It does matter. Yes, what primarily makes history is aggregates. Actually, I think Marx is right about that. The large movements of history aren't about great men or aren't about lucky men. I mean, one of the things that we should stop thinking about as great men is men who actually were great. Sometimes they're just people who just happen to be at the right spot at the right fucking time. But there is both a kind of necessary development and a contingency that is very hard to like keep in your head at the same time. It's a big ask. Yeah, physics does still allow for the remote possibility that the pound of bricks will rise instead of drop, which is why Hume actually had a point about the problem of induction. Just because there's a 99.99% chance that those bricks are going to drop every time There's the 0.001% chance that they don't, and it does occasionally happen. There's a reason, but nonetheless. There's a crisis at the heart of our only hope. The left is unable to do what is needed. That leaves the right bad situation. I mean, yeah. But the thing is, one, as I've said again, the conditions that the left, whatever that is, and the right, whatever that is, and I do think those are meaningful, but they're hard to like have a concrete universal definition for. Um, they're always dealing with conditions that are changing. Uh, that's bad, Hume. I'm sure you guys are going to get all philosophically sophisticated. Actually, no, it's not a particularly great reading of Hume. Um, but all the nuance and sophistication in the world aren't going to help you make a point in 5 minutes. And I was literally going on how academic bullshit that doesn't help you actually understand the world any better is a way to distract you from it. And I'm not an anti-intellectual. If someone calls me an anti-intellectual, they're full of shit. I tell people to read everything they can. But I do sort of get tired at like, and it's not so much with Hume. I get it more with like Carl Schmitt, with people bringing up subcategories of this sub thing that Carl Schmitt said that goes against the general reading. And I'm like, okay, who gives a fuck? Like, I'm not saying that because it's not true. I'm not saying that because it couldn't matter in a certain sub situation where this clause and nuance really matters. But the general movement is probably more important than the nuance. But yeah, I mean, most people, I mean, like, look at what most people say Marx believed. It's like even people who believe in Marx, when you actually quote Marx, they're usually like way off. But in some ways, even though I make a living correcting that, and I'm one of those, well, actually, Marx really thought, like, it doesn't fucking matter at a certain point. If I can't convince people that what Marx actually said matters for what your ideology is, or what other people said matters, or there's other, if I can't convince them of that, the relevance is obviously not really clear to other people. You do have an obligation to communicate well, and I think that's very important. But I actually want to pull back for a second and say people also have an obligation to listen well. And I'm a little bit tired of like me being told that I'm responsible, and I say this because I'm a teacher, that I'm responsible for active bad listening in individuals. Now, if that's across the board, if it's an aggregate problem, the problem's on me. Right? Or I don't understand my audience. I just don't understand what they respond to. Like another thing that you could say, you have an obligation to understand who you're speaking to and to address them clearly. But I can't control what people do or do not use what I say for. And it's actually super frustrating because I kind of get accused of being like every ideology under the goddamn sun. At a point, I just stopped caring because what does it matter? Like, I'm not trying to communicate an ideologically coherent position already to you. I'm trying to figure out what would be coherent and what is actionable and where that overlaps and where it doesn't. And I have to admit, I don't always or often know. And when people don't struggle about this and they don't show the sausage to their uh to to their audience and to their comrades and to their colleagues, then um there's this kind of falsehood, and yeah, I get called arrogant all the time, and let's be honest, I kind of am. Like, I know that, But for example, I'm often asked for when I read text to like summarize it and then give my interpretation. And the reason why I don't do that is I'm trying to show people at this point how you should approach this and what I'm thinking when I do. That is a sausage made in an intellectual level. When I teach people something physical, and I do so, all the time. I'm a teacher. Are like when like how to dress a wound, right? Um, how to clean a firearm, or how to. I'm not really good with fixing computers, believe it or not. I leave that to my partner. She's way better at it than me. But are how to edit a video, or which is used to be a physical task. It's kind of still, but not the same way it used to be. I am old enough that when I used to lay out zines and stuff, we were playing with computers, but we still did them by pushboard. Um, I mean, it is interesting how different it is when you grow up in an analog world, and the kind of stuff we're doing right now is unbelievably technically hard. And it still is unbelievably technically hard, but since it's digitized, I don't really know I don't have to know how to actually do it. Like, I don't have to know how to code all this stuff. Um, but you guys should learn that. And, I'm not the person to go to for that, right? I mean, I feel like I'm screaming in the void sometimes when I'm like, learn as many things as you can. I've been trying to learn like uses of calculus now. I'm not a mathematician. I don't really need it, but I know there's whole spots of the world that I don't know. I can't help people learn until I have a better grasp of that. I can't call out, for example, when someone's making a mechanical prediction off of history, like whether or not it's Cleodynamics or Kondrava waves, if I can't parse out when something is meaningful statistically from something that's just noise. Elon Musk here is good at computers. Oh boy. I mean, probably. So yeah, you have to show how the sausage is made, and no one wants to do that because everyone wants propriety over the sausage, right? Like, I keep on getting asked why I have such low subs on this, and I'm like, well, I don't monetize my videos, and I don't monetize my videos because I don't want that kind of oversight. This would get pulled down, for example, and demonetized. So what's the point, right? Um, my goal is to build a community that people like engage in the humanities in a contextual way that they can actually use, um, as opposed to whatever the fuck most research is for. And sometimes it really is a lot of me saying, like, you guys want me to give you answers, and no individual can give you a social answer like this. I can give you ways to arrive at that answer. I can give you skills to help you be a part of the group that kind of comes to an answer, but I can't give you the answer. And sometimes people come and ask me, like, well, what do I do, as to get involved in a union when I'm not in a union and not in a field that can be easily unionized, blah, 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 blah. And sometimes I really have to go, well, you just can't. There's other things you can do to have social solidarity and help out, but you kind of can't do a thing that requires you to have skin in a game that you aren't in. Wait, you have answers you've been holding out on me. Yeah, I know. Right? I just get tired of people pretending they have answers when they don't. Like, when people ask me what to do about union stuff, do we do McAlevey or Kim Moody? I'm like, well, frankly, but both have had results on certain things, but neither one of them have achieved what they set out to achieve, if we're honest. And one of the things that really bothers me about the left, that I see more on the left than the right, frankly, this is kind of an ideological difference, is we really like underdogs to the point that we valorize and make saints out of people who lose over and over again, and yet give them more and more capacity the more they lose. How many times was Giannis Varoufakis been nobly wrong? Or Corbyn, or even Bernie Sanders, especially Bernie Sanders. Why do we reward that? Why are we always going back to our favorite academics, almost all of whom failed at what they wanted to do? Have you seen the recent rise of the popularity of McNair's Kautsky and centrist line and revolutionary strategy amongst younger socialists? Speaking from the Netherlands, by the way. I saw more of that actually 10 years ago than I do now. I mean, Mug is more ascendant than the CPGB McNair's party ever was. I mean, even though Marxist Unity Group, maybe, wait, I don't know. It's between 80 and like 150 people. I'm not going to out their exact numbers, and I don't know them anyway. I know they've told me what they're less than, because I assumed they're about 200, and they said they were less than that. And that's, they have a lot of influence in an organization of 50 to 60,000, which is still a relatively small organization. I mean, like, if you look at France Unbowed, which is not succeeding as much as my friend would like them to believe, they have like 600,000 in a much smaller country. So, it's a different kind of failure. But even if you take the fact that all the far left progressives are like something like 9% of the population, you don't see them in like left activist orgs or whatever, because that 9% of the population is ideological, identified with very low commitment. And, we can talk about the demographics of that. It likes to pretend that it's of color and women, but it's mostly like college educated white dudes. And I don't say that. I mean, I'm not saying that as an intimate critique. There's just a totally, like, there's a deliberate pretending that if you make the leadership diverse, that will somehow change the base, and it just doesn't. So have I seen an increase of it? I mean, I think Mug is fairly successful, but Mug is not consistently neo-Kautskian, even though Donald Parkinson and Cosmonauts editorial board is. So maybe. I mean, it seems to replace the function that used to be played by Trotskyism in some way, because Trotskyism, with the exception of the IMT, largely liquidated itself into the DSA and has mostly gone the way of the dodo bird. Which is why I find it funny that I get accused of being a Trotskyist so much, because I'm like, I don't even super like Trotsky. I don't hate him either, but like, and I will defend like obviously made up bullshit history where people are saying he's doing stuff that he was already dead for. There's no way he did some of like, he was involved in Hitler's invasion of Stalingrad somehow, and I'm like, he was dead like 2 years before that happened. So yeah. I think one of the things that you'll see is ideological stridency increase on the far left as it actually is less and less effective and losing its ability to either do the ideological stridency or to focus on any one thing. And you even see it with stuff like Palestine. Like, the stuff in Palestine is going on, but you wouldn't know it from left discourse. I mean, it gets brought up a little bit, but now that people are opposing things domestically, it's like you can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. Just like during when everybody was focused on foreign policy, they weren't focusing on domestic issues. It's I don't know why. Maybe it's some kind of human foible that you can't keep your mind on two such complicated things at once. I don't know. Do we have to keep relitigating old beef between historical figures over 100 years ago? Well, that's a sign that we're in LARP, or not even LARP, maybe massive online role playing or mass delusionary politics. I mean, that is a debate almost about myth, about what myth you want to oppose and justify your current action under, because you do see it in other kinds of politics. Like, you see it about people debating what the founding fathers thought in America, or I don't know what European liberals do, but they have something, I'm sure. So yeah. Thoughts on the UK comedy fusion process discussion with party programs? I mean, the party programs have to come from something more organic than socialist intellectuals trying to impose them. The merger thesis actually does imply a merger that would affect the party program. And I do think some of the Neo-Kalskians understand that, but people in practice are very hesitant to do that. I really don't get these burning rallies. They are right in the middle of the week, like for people who must have taken off from work. I think the burning rallies are like, frankly, it's disturbing to me, and I don't know what to make of the fact that we see like Bill Kristol and the neoconservative parts of the Bulwark and whatever, like uh talking about these rallies. But it is also interesting. I said this to someone else. I was talking to Matt McManus, who's far more liberal than me, but I do respect him. And I was talking about it's fascinating to me because when Bowman at the end the of his run, AOC and Bernie had a rally to support Bowman in the greater New York area, which you would think they would be super strong in. I mean, AOC's from the area, Bernie's adjacent to it. Um, they had like 500 people come out, and now he's drawing like 10,000 in the middle of the day in the Midwest. But I don't think it has anything to do with Bernieism. I think it has to do with people think he's the only Democrat showing any resistance to Trump. Is it actual resistance? I mean, I don't know. It's yet to be seen. It's hard to know what is real until it's already happened, which is a very frustrating thing to say. Like, you can't know what is ideologically real until after it is passed. This is a very ideologically frustrating thing to say. It's not something that people are ever going to be happy or comfortable with. Their rallies for the Dems essentially, and not just the Dems. I mean, Bill Kristol going back to the Democratic Party is actually an indication that even the sock Dems have some weird attraction for the Scoop Jackson form of the Democrats that actually became the basis of neoconservatism a decade later. The people Bernie are drawing are libs, not Sandinistas. Well, guys, I want you to remember though that all these ideological things are in flux. They're all in flux. Like, you guys like making grand proclamations about useful or useless as if you know what it is. I don't feel comfortable making those things anymore. I'm not here to say that I think that anything good is going to come out of. In fact, what I think will come out of the Bernie rallies is some sort of yet again revitalization of the Democratic Party. But I don't know what to tell people to do. I mean, like, I'm telling people to primary everybody. I mean, like, encourage people to primary in all conditions. I don't care what party. You know, if you're going to engage in electoral politics right now, it should be like oppositional and to get rid of dead weight, and that's it. But I don't really have a program for what people should do because I don't think you really can do a whole lot in this current situation. I mean, that route. And again, going back to the beginning, we can get stuck in the semantics of all this if we want to. It's not particularly useful. Everything is fluid. What are we who claim to be materialists going to do with that is actually the question. And are we going to get sucked into the hype? Are we going to get sucked into the counter hype? Because a lot of people who don't get sucked into the hype get sucked into the counter hype, which is still letting the hype define them. Asking people to come up with something truly independent that also involves other people is apparently a very, very hard ask in the world where fandoms substitute for social community so much. It's a hard ask. It's a hard ask. Anyway, I'm wrapping up. I got to go back to grading. Another reason why you guys haven't heard from me, I don't talk about my day job a lot. I'm not going to be undisciplined to talk about it too specifically now, but my student numbers have doubled in the past 6 months, and my union has been crushed. They're trying to fight it by a last ditch referendum. Um, uh, and I'm really ambivalent about a lot of this in ways that I don't feel totally comfortable talking about, because I'm both disgusted that we're in this situation, but also disgusted about how unserious they took it until after it happened. Which seems to be everything right now, is no one takes anything seriously till it's already passed and almost too late. Um, and so, and I publicly stated this on Twitter. I resigned after 4 years. I'm not running again for to be an association rep anymore. You know, I'm not leaving the union or whatever, but I'm not running again. I just don't have it in me. And the world of endless meetings for something that never seems to happen, I'm just fucking tired of it myself. But, you know, at least I don't lie to you about what union conditions were. And I feel like both Democrats and Soc Dems were, or Dem Socs or whatever they want to call themselves, were gaslighting people about the state of the union movement from 2019 to about 2 years ago. Yeah, it is a consequence of not knowing what's real until it's already happened, but this was something where you should have prepared for what was possibly real because it was obvious that it could have happened. No, I know. The thing is, you don't know who's going to be a liberal or not. You don't know who's going to be on whose side. I mean, guys, look, my political history is proof that people really do radically change. And yet also they don't radically change their internal values. They radically change what they think those values are expressed as. Like, but you have to be careful with anybody who's projected as an individual leader of the movement. I mean, we can see the Chris Smalls is a predictable story. Totally predictable. And it isn't because he people like read it, maybe he always had bad. No, he didn't have to have, you know, he didn't have to have delusions of grandeur. Can I get help with an essay? I mean, I don't have a lot of time. People ask me that all kinds of times. But we all move around. I mean, I do pride myself on being remarkably consistent in my basic values, but how they get expressed, they are not always consistent. They really aren't. And then there are people who say the same thing, but what the thing that they say actually means shifts so radically that you can't even recognize what they're talking about anymore. That also happens. So people who sound like they're consistent, but when you look at what that actually leads to, they're radically off. I mean, and this is a particular incentive amongst people who are only media creators, if I'm honest, because they have to keep a crowd and they have to give a crowd kind of what it wants. You guys don't pay people to tell you the truth. I mean, you as individuals might, but in general, people don't pay people to tell them the truth. They pay people to reify what they think they believe right now. We definitely see that in the media. And I don't just mean the mainstream media. If anything, the incentives in the alternative media are just as bad or maybe even worse. I know so many people that have basically sold out all their principles while still talking as if believe the same thing because they need to keep an audience that is constantly shifting. I see it happen at all levels of interaction, including people much lower than me and people much higher than me. Um, A lot of people can't deal with the fact that they'd have to make a new choice, that the new choice won't be delivered to them. I mean, because you're basically saying no one's gonna save you. And even though people might know that, they don't really wanna hear it. That doesn't mean that you can't get out of the situation, but it's like no one's gonna, you're trapped in a rock and you're trapped between a rock and a mountain, and you can cut your own arm off, or you can just wait until you die, but like you're gonna have to do one or the other, and that's kind of where you're at. So if you want to build a new choice, you have to admit that you have to build it, and you have to admit that you're going to take losses and it's going to have an immediate cost. And no one wants the immediate cost. And I agree with you on the social subject stuff. I think a lot of left-wing and liberal habits have really degenerated our social subject. We tell people that they are okay just the way they are, and they're not. They aren't okay. But that's across the board. That's a social norm now. You're already fine. Even though you feel like you're falling apart and are a total wreck, you're fine. Just give yourself some self-care. You know, and that's the insecurity that people in the manosphere and stuff really play on. They really do. Because people kind of know they're not fine. Like, I'll tell you a story, and I'm going to be very personal in a way that I'm normally not. I used to be over 300, and we don't actually know how heavy. Right? I'm not a skinny man now. I'm still overweight. I'm not giving you some kind of bullshit. I used my thing and I got svelte and I got super buff. I mean, I can lift weights and I'm pretty healthy now. I actually stopped the effects of uh type 2 diabetes from diet and exercise, and then kind of from losing parts of my stomach. But um and I am not a person who believes that you should stigmatize certain things like weight. And there are people who are healthy at way large sizes. There are, but it's not a norm. All right. It's not a norm. And if I'd have stayed in the lifestyle that was encouraged for me as a poor working class Southerner whose main comforts were cheap food and alcohol, either alcoholism or obesity would have got my ass probably already. I don't judge people. I know that a lot of former fat people have a part of themselves that hate themselves, hate what they used to be. And I really try not to embrace that. I don't think that's helpful for me. I don't think that's helpful for other people. But I'm not going to tell people that it's just okay no matter what, even though I do recognize the confounding factors and everything else. Yeah, and the food isn't that cheap. You're right. There's nothing is cheap. Now people probably just going to huff gasoline or yeah, it's expensive, but I don't know. So I don't want to shame people for what they lack, particularly because these are social problems. These affect people from certain social classes for reasons that are not their own personal fault. But just saying that it's okay is like saying, I'll give you another example from academia. There's a lot of discussion about poor people's metis, which is a category that we have from Aristotle, but it means cutting or like kind of playing with the system. And I pointed out that, oh, it is ironic that you have all these people talking about the progressiveness of poor people using metis when the fact that they're talking about it as a way to empower poor people is actually because they're disempowered in the systems that they work in. And you're actually celebrating how fucked up those systems are by valorizing the metis they have to use to survive in them. And it actually does lead to antisocial and anti-solidaristic behaviors. can we be fucking honest about that instead of just pretending that everything the underdog does is good and somehow good for the underdog? Because it's not. Metis, Metis, when it's anglicized. I don't know what it is in Greek letters off the top of my head. It's also the root word of the word métis, which means cunning or assimilated. And the reason why it was used by the French for the Métis people, I think actually was an insult initially, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It may just be a convergent word. But we should not tell people that what they already are forced to do is just okay. But also, a lot of people who are attacking other people for this shit do not have their lives together in any way, form, or fashion and are total disasters. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. The people who are an independent people who are mixed, usually French and indigenous with francophone and anglophone backgrounds, who are kind of a separate indigenous category in Canada. But it's not, yeah, it's not a singular ethnic group. It doesn't have one tribe that it comes from or one singular ethnicity. But the word, I think, and I don't know, I actually haven't done the etymological research, I think is related to the Greek word for cunning or assimilated. But it could be just a convergent etymology by accident. I really would have to look it up. All right. So I'm alive. Um, you guys may be wondering what order you're getting stuff in from on the channel. I record things pre-recorded, but they're at radically different times. So sometimes you'll get an interview that happened 2 months ago. There's been some interviews that mention Trump stuff that were recorded either in November or January that are like kind of embarrassing already. Um, uh, and then, but it's actually good practice for me to think about what can I say that is gonna last versus what can I say that attracts people in the moment. So I'm trying to think that way. Um, so yeah, I gotta go do some grading. I got work to do, and it is late here. It's 11 p.m. Um, and I'm an old man now. Uh, I mean, I'm a weirdo who started my left wing media career over now, God, 13 years ago, and I was already over 30 when I started. So spite keeps me young, and having grew up in the South where everything is humid. Um, Nonetheless, take care. Don't drink as much diet soda as I do, and try to think clearly. Things are gonna get real weird. It's gonna be a challenge to think clearly about things and not get sucked up into every fad and every moral panic and everything that happens. Um, and it's gonna be real hard to resist that. I find it hard for me. I'm a big preacher of don't get sucked up in just acting off of fear. Don't get sucked up in just acting off of of immediate moral fads or whatever. But it's even hard for me when everyone around me is doing it. Take care. Protect your peace. Keep your mind clean.